group. It was a consensus that reached the press, it reached the political world, it certainly really it reached the intellectual world. I'm now, as you know, at MIT, and I say to some of my academic friends that the intellectual underpinnings of this was created at MIT and places like that.
With the technology, the computers?
Well, no, it's the mathematics. It's all of this mathematics of finance and the presumption in much of this mathematics that you can capture risk by looking at historical volatility and so forth and so on. As soon as you say something appears not to be risky, you get an overinvestment in it because the capital requirements are less. And then if something does go wrong, the hurt is all the more because you don't have the capital to take the risks. And, you know, if somebody says, walk across that sheet of ice, there's no danger whatsoever you're going to fall in, you know, you're fine as long as you don't fall in. But
are you suggesting, the chairman of the board of MIT suggesting that human intelligence no longer runs our financial system?
Well, it's a little wisdom, balance, and judgment wouldn't hurt.
So how, when you look back on it, how did so many people, including yourself, get it wrong?
We were carried away by the enthusiasm, and like everything else, you know, once you start, you probably go a little further than you should have. We started out lending mortgages to customers and putting them on our balance sheet. Then in the 90s, when the mortgage-backed securities came into being, we found that you couldn't economically do that, so we would package our mortgages and we'd sell them to a Wall Street firm who would then pass them on to their customers. Pretty soon, we were in the business ourselves after the merger, and so all of a sudden these mortgage-backed securities could be distributed throughout our own company, and pretty soon people said, well, why only package the securities that your customers create? Why don't we go out to mortgage brokers and start buying some of their securities, and we'll package those and we'll sell them? And then I was retired at the time, but you read in the press, and you may even have seen on television, no doc and low doc. Now, no doc, low doc means no documentation or low documentation. Low meaning less than the regulators would require of you.
You didn't ask the person, the homeowner who was buying the house, show me proof of your wages, show me proof of your savings.
That's right. But can you imagine that you publicly acknowledged that you were creating products and selling them into the market that had no documentation or less than normal required documentation? And this was, it's sort of like taking a product and putting a skull and crossbones on, saying this might be poison, and putting it on the supermarket shelves.
You know, I hear you talking, and I think, well, human beings certainly can go insane. So can systems, right?
Yeah, and so can groups of human beings. In the 90s, the investors took over. And they basically said to management, we don't care what you do, we don't care how many private jets, houses, golf courses, swimming pools, whatever you have, as long as you keep the share price going up. If share price goes down, we're going to get rid of you even if you're good. And managers started being scared of their stockholders. And this idea of shareholder value came into being. I never heard the word shareholder value till the 90s. It was customers, customers, customers. How are the customers? Are we doing well? Are we losing place with the customers? But all of a sudden, and Sandy was a total proponent.
Sandy Weil.
Sandy Weil. I mean, his whole life was to accumulate money. And he said, John, we could be so rich. Being rich never crossed my mind as an objective. I almost was embarrassed that somebody would say out loud. It might be happening, but you wouldn't want to say it. But you know, the biggest bonus I had ever received when I was at Citi was $3 million. The first year I worked with Sandy, it was 15. I said to the board, I'm the same guy doing the same job, same company. There are two of us. The company's bigger, but there are two of us. What's going on? Oh, you don't understand. And it was just totally different culture. And see, Wall Street developed that culture.
That's what happened, isn't it?
And it happened. It happened in Wall Street, and there's a subset of the world that self-selects, for whom money is an overriding value, and being personally rich somehow is something they aspire to. And, you know, it's a minority of the population. Bill Gates certainly did not start Microsoft to become rich, nor do I think Steve Jobs went back to Apple because he wanted to be rich. These were byproducts. They became rich, but as a byproduct. But there is a subset of the population that self-selects, and they go to Wall Street because that's where it's somewhat legitimate. You can do the same thing illegally, but and there are people who do that. I mean, there is a drug cartel and so forth and so on. But the thing that has amazed me is, A, it's fairly large, and two, it's sort of been accepted.
How do you explain that?
That's one of these mind changes. I don't know. When I joined the bank, they said, never put on the bank's balance sheet something you wouldn't sell your mother.
Is this an accurate thumbnail sketch of what happened over this period of time? Banks took too many risks, right?
Yes, they did. But there are worse things, but they certainly
What were
did.
the worst things?
Well, they originated and sold into the marketplace things that should never have been originated.
Derivatives, unregulated derivatives?
Well, it was the excess mortgages, the no-doc, low-doc mortgages, and then the derivatives were a byproduct. Once you had those, then you could chop them up and so forth. And of course, they had changed their mindset. They were in the business to make money, period.
The exuberance you said took over. Isn't democracy supposed to be a brake, B-R-A-K-E, on greed and power in the private sector to keep the balance, to keep the exuberance from going too far as it did this case?
It should, but you're a better historian than I am. I don't know, but I would guess that democratic systems tend to go back and forth.
Like a seesaw.
Like a seesaw.
But when you take the watchdog off the beat, as happened in the 1990s, when you lift Glass-Steagall and throw it on the into the dustbin of history, you're removing any check in behalf of the public on the exuberance of the private sector.
I mean, a consensus developed. The fact that we took it out was a byproduct of this mistaken belief in this modern financial system that was, quote, more efficient, was very lucrative for the United States and the U.S. economy in global terms, and which was supposed to handle risk better. In fact, it handled risk worse. I mean, this is what the facts are, because there was a much greater concentration of risk created. And so we got it wrong, but the restraint of the government and its agencies disappeared in the enthusiasm. And so it was this combination of the participants getting carried away, the normal checks and balances that should exist against participants, and the thing that is astounding, frankly, and there's a lesson here that we probably haven't yet learned, is that the system can get it so wrong. It wasn't wrong. It wasn't that there was one or two institutions that, you know, got carried away and did stupid things. It was we all did. And then the whole system came down. You know, it became illiquid, the government stepped in. Had the government not stepped in, it really would have come to an end.
Should the government have spent billions of dollars of taxpayer money in bailing out the banks?
I think they had no choice. I think they had to do it, yes.
Why?
The alternative was worse. Letting the banks all collapse, which would have spread across the world because banks lend to banks. So the interconnections were such that they just couldn't allow a meltdown of that scale. And we see in the Lehman bankruptcy that we're, I don't know how many years since, but it must be 3 or 4, And they're still unraveling the bits and pieces. And had it been the whole system, it simply would have been a calamity that, from a societal point of view, would have been worse. So I think they had no choice. They did have to bail them out. And they did do it, and it did succeed.
But they left in place the very people who had driven the ship into the iceberg.
I'm quite surprised at that. It clearly has not been a clean sweep. In other words, those of us who made mistakes and so forth and so on are still floating around the system. And
floating it, you're running it.
Well, I am.
You're not running it, they're running it.
But there are many who are. I wasn't involved, obviously. I had retired in the year 2000. We're not talking 2008. So I was a knowledgeable spectator, but certainly not a participant. I was quite surprised because, frankly, the worst thing that can happen to a businessman is to go bankrupt. That's the sign of ultimate failure. You ran a business and it was unable to succeed under the terms and conditions of private capital, namely you went bankrupt. It's not a crime, but it certainly is a mistake. And these companies, even though they didn't have to file for bankruptcy, de facto went bankrupt. And so the managements and the boards and the regulators should have, in my mind, stepped aside.
How hard was it for you to go before Congress in 2010 and say, I was wrong, I made a mistake? In fact, you said we created a monster.
No, look, you don't like saying this. The hard part probably preceded my testimony by 2 or 3 years, where I came to recognize and feel, and I still feel bad. And I feel bad for the people of Citibank who lost jobs and, so forth and so on. But not to mention our stockholders. But, I am a realist. I try very hard to be honest with myself and honest in what I, say. And facts are facts. I've seen Sandy a couple times, not
Sandy Weill.
Yeah, Sandy Weill, and I sort of say, Sandy, we didn't do very well, and he's not comfortable with that conversation at all. I think he would still defend that it was a good merger. It just went off the tracks afterwards.
When it went off the tracks, John, millions of people lost their jobs. Millions of people lost their homes. Millions of people saw their savings.
Well, if you look at the lost product in the United States, in other words, the difference between our current economic trajectory and the potential economic trajectory, you're talking about trillions of dollars. And those dollars are jobs and output and so forth and so on. I mean, we over-leveraged, and that was because, we were creating mortgages so as to sell them into the market, and we were creating them from customers who probably should not have been borrowing. They didn't know what they were originating, didn't know who was buying it, and they didn't care. They were getting paid commissions along the way. And that's a fundamentally flawed system. If you say to a businessman, what is your objective? And he says, my objective is to make money. There are no boundaries on that. I mean, it's only the law as to what you do in the middle. It would be better if you said, I'm in business to serve my customers or to create a product like an iPad or what have you, but something that has intrinsic value. And all of a sudden we change to, hey, I'm not totally sure what we're doing here. Maybe it's not right, but you know what? I'm getting paid my commission. And that mindset took over. And a lot of that money did flow into the political coffers. There's no question.
What do you mean?
Donations. If you're rolling in money in a business, it's very easy for you to have a PAC and to contribute to campaigns and so forth and so on. And we went through a period of time when there was an immense amount of money. I don't mean small. I mean, we took this